All right, and I'm going to share my screen. And with any luck, you're seeing a PowerPoint slide, huh? So yes, we'll have death by PowerPoint again today. Maybe it works. There we go. I think as we're going through this, if you have questions, just go ahead and speak up. Because I'm working off a single screen, so I won't be able to see any of the comments until I get clear to the end. So just go ahead and interject with questions and whatnot as you have them. I have a couple of topics for today. The first one is the funding BP, which really does only involve agency staff. The second one deals more with starting up projects and some of the new requirements that version 2 brings around starting up projects, and that will involve agency and K-12 both. So K-12 folks, don't leave on me. I had actually originally put this together to bring in like 3 weeks ago, and some of our first pilots had gotten to the point where they were doing some of the very first funding business process records, and we figured out that we had some issues, and so we had to go back and make some revisions to the BP and work out those issues. And it's really only this week that I've gotten to a point where everything's settled down enough that I feel like we can talk about how this is all supposed to work. So we'll go forward. Funding BP was put in no small part to meet some of our OAKS version 2 goals. We wanted to implement the work process redesign and unify all the processes. Interestingly enough, the funding BP came about because the funding processes between agency, higher ed, and school facilities are very unique. And Craig made the recommendation at some point during UAT testing that we pull all the funding processes out of the BPs, so that we basically have a document BP. We do an agreement document, or we do a contract document. And then separate from that, we have the funding processes. So the document BPs are consistent and are done the same for K-12 and agency, and all of the unique attributes got pulled out into this funding BP. Currently, we do not have any kind of funding BP for K-12. If we find a need for that, we can certainly develop a K-12 funding business process as well. Right now, these kinds of activities are being done by K-12 outside of the process. So this is a brand new BP. There is no original version equivalent in OAKS. We use the funding BP to request a purchase order be issued by the sponsoring agency. And that's really what it is. It's to request a purchase order. It can apply to a purchase order for almost any purpose. So it's not, we'll be using it here initially on all these projects we're starting to get a purchase order for our AE agreement, possibly for a CMR or design build pre-construction agreement. But if you were doing a GMP amendment and you needed it funded, you would use the funding BP for that as well. And it basically was designed to separate the funding activities from the associated contract document activities. The funding BP addresses, and we'll go through these in more detail individually, it addresses admin fees, contract release and permit numbers, contract or release and permit numbers, rec letters, controlling board, and purchase order. So it covers a lot of ground as we work through all this. Here's a high-level look at the workflow. One of the things that changed 3 weeks ago was that finance came in and said, hey, we're changing, or we have changed the process since we did UAT on this business process, and we don't want to issue release and permit numbers or contract numbers until we have controlling board information in hand. So we reworked this workflow. Those of you who looked at this during UAT, we were issuing contract numbers first. We are now issuing contract numbers after the controlling board information is provided. So we create a funding BP record, and there is somebody who is not on mute, and I keep hearing you. drag things around your desk. So if everybody will look and make sure you're on mute, I would really appreciate it. We start the funding workflow with the project coordinator. They do the creation stuff. It then goes to a Java application. This is the first time we've ever done this. We have a Java application that does the admin fee calculation and pushes the workflow forward for a fiscal review. Basically, what we're doing right now is we're having fiscal check that our Java application is calculating fees correctly. At some point in the future, we'll probably remove that step once we get some confidence in the Java application. But right now we're having everything basically being checked manually. And then we go to a rec letter issue step. So it goes back to the project coordinator. And what we are trying to accomplish is we want to have as much information as we can possibly get on that rec letter already there. So the project coordinators can take that rec letter and issue them. We then send the workflow to the owner. It goes to the owner's rep, and the owner's rep goes to controlling board, and they'll enter the controlling board information, send it back to our fiscal staff, who will add the contract number or release and permit number, whichever is appropriate. And that, let me pause there, because it's actually going to go back to our project coordinators for the contract number or release and permit number. I'll talk about the details of that when I actually get to the slide on that particular step. So in the future, this will probably go to fiscal, but right now it's being returned to the project coordinator to get that contract number or release and permit number put on it. And finally, it goes back to owner financial for PO creation. Yes, Sylvia.
You know that PCs can't do R&P numbers, right? Only fiscal can do that.
We'll talk about that in detail when we get to the slide.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, Steve, this is Tom. I got a quick question for you.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the funding workflow, what you're talking about now, what's in place prior to this are the 4 criteria items that you had identified in the email you sent out to the group prior, in terms of getting everything put into the system. And that talks about the milestones, it talks about the budget, it talks about essentially the funding, which is identified with the project initiation form, and also with the admin fee structure, which is somewhat internal. My question, and I had sent you a quick email the other day. My question is, I don't know if it's been resolved in terms of utilizing the workflow prior to actually going to the funding workflow and getting the project in the system follows your traditional design professional, your AE, getting them on board. There's going to be occasions where, for instance, I use an example with the agency in higher ed. In my instance, I have to utilize a consultant, a design professional from the consultant list. But by engaging those type of services, it's more of a feasibility study. So to determine what the construction budgets are for the upcoming capital bill, these are line items that we're trying to determine what the budgets are. So there's, I guess, some unknowns in the beginning of the process of getting everything into the system, so that we can get through the funding workflow. And my question is, some criteria are unknown, as I mentioned. I don't know what the budget is. I'm unable to put together a budget. We're trying to determine a budget. This is just a feasibility study. Is there a way, and we don't have to talk about it in detail now, but it's something that I think maybe we can take a look at. I have a project now that I need to move forward with, and again, it's a feasibility study. So there's some items that are going to be unknown in the initial stages.
So Tom, can we take that offline?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and I do have your email, and I will respond to it.
Okay.
So in general, back to looking at the individual steps of the funding BP, the first step is creation. And what we want you to do, the creation step is done by the coordinators. And we're going to create all the information for a rec letter. And one of those things is the admin fees. So to correctly calculate the admin fees, our application who's going to do that needs visibility to all of the contracts and agreements that you want included on that initial rec letter. So if all you're doing is an AE agreement, that's great. Put your AE agreement in and then create your funding BP. But if you're doing an AE agreement and you're also doing a design build pre-construction agreement, and you're going to put both of those on one rec letter that you're going to send to the agency, then we want both of those contracts to be submitted before you put in a funding record for either of them. And once those contracts are in and in some kind of pending state in OCI, so they have to be more than a draft, but once you get those in and get those in some kind of pending status, then you can create the funding records for both of them. And you'll select one commit on each funding record. So if you're doing an agreement and you're also doing a design build agreement for pre-construction services, you're going to have two funding records, but you're probably only going to issue one rec letter. And we'll calculate fees on both of those funding records. And if life is treating me well that day, they will come out the same. And so you can pick up either one of them. It doesn't matter. They should be the same and they should be correct. So one of the things that we ask for in here, and it's kind of highlighted here on the right-hand side of your screen, is rec letter type. The choices are design or construction. And rec letter type is important because it drives the fee calculation. We calculate fees differently for design stage and for construction stage. And so rec letter type, once you pick it, will determine how we go out and do fee calculation. If it's incorrect, we would calculate fees incorrectly, simply because we would be calculating for the wrong point in the project. So those are basically the keys here. Really, all you're going to do is put in a title. You're going to tell it what kind of contract this is. You're going to select the contract and the rec letter type, and you're done. So it's not a complicated BP by any means. It basically has those four inputs to it.
Okay, Steve, can you hear me?
I can.
What happens if there's a lag between the first agreement that we're going for and we need to get that in place, and then there's a second one several months later? So there'd be two separate functions, not both at the same time. That's
okay.
The way. I think assuming that it's all going to come through in one rec letter is rare.
And so in those cases, what you would do today is you would send a rec letter with each. What you will do in version 2 is you will do a funding record for the agreement and work it through to conclusion. Then 2 or 3 months later, when you bring on your additional commit, your additional contractor, you'll do this process again, and you'll send them an updated rec letter that will ask for, the additional fees associated with that. The amount of fees may not change because design phase fees are based on budget. So if the budget didn't change, the fees won't change. So on that second rec letter, you'd be asking for the second contract, purchase order for the second contract, and no additional fees for our fee.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, other questions about creation before we move on and cover the other, I'm going to cover each step in detail here. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do, previously in the original version of OCI, the coordinators would calculate the fees. What we've done in this version is we've used the same engine that calculates the fees when we do billing to calculate the fees for the rec letter. So as we update that over time with new fee structures or new rules, those changes will get made. So OAKS-CI actually calculates the admin fee and writes them onto the funding record. So there's a block on there called OFCC admin fees. This has gotten updated slightly in the last 3 weeks, so this picture is a little bit out of date because the way this was set up originally, what you're seeing here is just the 40% fee. We're now showing the full amount of the estimated, and we're actually calling it that, the estimated OFCC fee. And then we're showing the amount of fee request for this rec letter. So hopefully those terms are clear. And both of those will be on the form when it comes back from this calculate admin fee step, which is done in Java. In red, on the lower right-hand corner, there are 2 very important prerequisites to this step working correctly. We need an original budget. If there's no original budget at all, this step will fail and produce an error. And I'll get an email in my email that there's been an error doing a fee calculation in the funding BP. So this is one of the reasons we tell you that we need to get a budget into OAKS-CI early. We'll talk more about that in my second presentation. But we need the budget that you want to use for the fee calculation. So that can be updated for the AE agreement or not updated for the AE agreement. That's completely your choice. We need some kind of budget in current status that's been pushed from the budget allocation tool in OAKS-CI before this step happens. The second thing we need is an admin fee billing structure, and that structure needs to be correct. And one of the things I'm going to tell you in the second presentation, I'll go ahead and tell you now, tell you again then, is we have added the admin fee structure to the project's initiation form. So we're asking you what fee structure to use, and we'll talk about fee structures in detail in that second presentation. No, we'll talk about fee structures in detail here because this is where the slide I thought was in the other presentation is. Let's talk about fee structures. Most of you use the universal fee structure, and that's the 3% on the first 4 million, 1% from 4 million to 20 million, and then 0.75% for everything over 20 million. So that's kind of the default for most projects. Where we have the project taking place at multiple sites, then we charge an additional fee called the multi-site fee. So we have built 2 fee structures in OAKS-CI. One's called the medium project multi-site fee, and the other is the large project multi-site fee. So the medium project multi-site fee is applicable to multi-site projects that are OFCC administered, the total budget of 4 to 20 million. And it basically adds 0.75% to the universal fee, to the whole universal fee from $0 to the end. And then the large project multi-site fee applies to multi-site projects that are OFCC administered with a total budget greater than 20 million. And again, we're going to add a fixed fee. In this case, that fee is going to be 1%. So that fee structure that you're going to use on your project needs to be set by the PM. If you're not sure as a PM which is appropriate, go talk to your program manager and figure out what the budget is and whether it's multi-site or not, and then get that set up correctly in the project. For new projects, we're going to ask you for it with project initiation. There are 50 existing projects out there that may or may not be set up at all or set up correctly. So again, I'm going to ask you to look at those. As PMs, you do not have the ability to change those, but you can send a ticket in, and Archana and the service desk can update those, and also finance can update those. So you can get those updated and get those correct on your project. And we may just make a report of all of those so that we can send it out and get those checked with folks. Questions about Java calculating the fees, the fee structure, anything around that before I go on? Hearing none. The workflow goes through a check step at fiscal. So we're gonna check those numbers for a while, and then it goes back to the project coordinator for rec letter creation. As Lane mentioned, we have been updating the rec letters and are trying to get not only the current rec letters in OAKS, but also get those rec letters filling in as much data as is available to us to fill in. I don't think on the rec letters we're able to fill in everything yet, so there's still some customization that goes on those, but we're trying to reduce that as much as possible. And coordinators, as you do these, if you see data that you think should be there, let's talk about that. Make me aware of it, make Rita or Brett aware of it, and we'll look at how we can get that data in place and get it on the rec letter, because this is supposed to be automation. It's supposed to reduce your work, not make it greater. So if we have multiple contracts going on the same rec letter, which occasionally we do, you're going to have multiple rec letters with one contract on them each. Take one of those, edit the letter to include all the contracts, and pull that together and send that to the agency. For right now and maybe forever. Go ahead.
So would you generate a separate letter for each contract and then take the data that is filled into the custom print and then consolidate that on one rec letter?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
So point I started to make is for now and maybe forever, we'll see. We're going to send the rec letter to the agency as we normally do. And different agencies, I think, receive rec letters to different people in different ways. Project coordinators, you know how you send rec letters to each of your agencies, and we don't want to change that. However, we will also be sending this funding record to the owner's rep, and it will have a copy of that rec letter attached to it. Typically, I would assume you're going to attach that rec letter to it. So they're going to receive it that way also. And we're going to ask the owner's rep, once they get controlling board, to provide us some information there. So we're going to send the rec letter the old way, and the new thing that's happening, and that will the owners are going to need to be made aware of, is that the record's going to workflow to the owner, and we're going to ask them to do something with it and send it back to us. So that's an important thing to communicate to your owners, and we're going to also try to do some communication through some other channels to the owners as well. Once the owner's rep receives this record, what we're basically waiting for them to do is get controlling board approval, and the owner's rep would then enter the controlling board information and request the contract number or release and permit number from OFCC. So they have just these two blocks that we asked them to fill in, and then forward the record back to OFCC. So this is how we receive that controlling board information now. This is OFCC only. So if your agency is working on local admin projects, they won't have anything like this in their local admin project. They'll only have this on their OFCC project. And one of the potential places we can get stuck is if the owner's rep doesn't know he needs to do this and doesn't do it, then we may not get this record back. So when they call asking for that contract number on the phone, we need to instruct them to go back into OCI and fill in this information and send it forward. Okay. All right, so here is a step that we've had some confusion on. And what we're going to do today is we're going to return this record to the project coordinators. Project coordinators, you have in the past been issuing contract numbers and putting those, I think, on the rec letters. Well, we're no longer going to put those on the rec letters, but you will, at this point, once we have the controlling board information, issue the contract number. And you'll put it actually on this record, on this funding record, and it's going to workflow again back to the agency, to their owner financial person to request that purchase order. If you need a release and permit number on this particular item, and you know which items those are, those have not changed, then you'll call fiscal like you do today and get the release and permit signed by fiscal. So basically in June of 2021, who does the creation of these things isn't changing. And the project coordinators are going to be responsible for obtaining them through whatever method you used up to now, and including them on this funding record. And you can see there's a small block down here that's kind of hard to see, but the contract number goes here, or the release and permit number goes here. I don't believe there's any situations where we would have both. And so none of these are required, because you're going to put one or the other in, and then forward the record to the agency. There is spaces here for the amounts. So when you do the contract number, if there's an amount associated with it, you can put that in. And there's a space here, and I don't think we've implemented it yet, so I think you can not worry about it for right now. Barb, correct me if I'm wrong, but contract numbers in Fin can have an expiration date. And if we were to implement that, we have a space here to put that expiration date. If there's no expiration date, then that field's not needed either. So, and again, highlight it one more time, the numbers issued need to be recorded in the funding BP. One of the reasons we're moving a lot of this into OAKS is we are working on a application that will bring project purchase orders from Fin back into OAKS. And the hook that we use to actually figure out where those go is this contract number or release and permit number. And so we need this information in OAKS. We need it to be here and to be correct in order to get the application that will bring purchase orders back to work correctly. So, and that application is under development now, and it's not too far out before we're going to have, I think, a working model of that. So, all right. So we're going to send this record back to Owner Financial for them to issue a purchase order. Again, this is probably a change in the way owner is used to getting that request for a purchase order. They've probably been doing something internal to the agency, and those processes may or may not be replaced. But even if they went and did it based on something they received internal to the agency, we want them to go in here and record the PO creation in OAKS for now until we get our application working. I would also say that all the info that they need, it's our intention at least to have all the info they need to create that purchase order in the funding BP altogether where they can find it. So in this case, if that's not the case, we want to make changes to the application to put that information in. So we're trying to make it very easy for them to take the funding record and go create the purchase order directly from it. And then as long as they have it open, recording that PO on a query tab that's right there on the BP is a pretty easy process also. We're going to encourage the agencies, even the ones that today have not historically entered their own POs, to do that. We have not changed the permissions, so owner financial or the project coordinator can enter those purchase orders for now. Lower right hand corner in red, again, there's a prerequisite here. Before anybody can put a purchase order in, we have to know what funds we're dealing with. So we're asking for fund information on the project initiation form. Again, I have about 40 or 50 in-flight projects that I don't necessarily have that information on. And so we need to have that entered to get here. And again, in the second presentation, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So in summary, funding BP is a new BP which automates the agency funding process, including admin fee calculation, rec letter creation, recording of controlling board information, contract number, release permit number issuing, and purchase order issue. You're going to create a funding record after you've submitted all of your agreement or contract records for the current rec letter. And admin fees will be calculated by Java and checked by finance. Contract numbers are now issued by the PC and recorded in the funding record. And this BP automates the rec letter creation process, but it does not replace the rec letter. Send the agency a rec letter as usual. Questions about anything we talked about?
Steve, just to confirm, for every contract you're creating, you need to run the funding BP for that contract.
I'll say it a little bit different.
Okay.
For every PO you need issued, you need to run the funding BP for that PO. So you may have a GMP amendment that needs a purchase order, or you may have a GMP amendment that does not need a purchase order, because when we did the contract, we allocated the funds. Okay.
Right.
Having a GMP amendment doesn't say I need a funding BP record. Needing a purchase order does.
Gotcha.
So the key is when I need a purchase order today, old system, when I need a purchase order, I think rec letter. New system, when I need a purchase order, I think funding BP.
Right, and that would also apply then to AE amendments. If you need a purchase order to fund it, you'd run the funding BP for that amendment.
Correct.
And can the funding BP select a PS amendment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it can.
Great.
And kind of related to that, because you can obviously do an amendment or you can do change orders out of your contingency contract. If you need to extend contingency, so you're going to ask the agency to do a purchase order to increase their contingency amount, you would do that with the funding BP. And again, we can link the funding BP to the contingency contract that you would put in. Would be a trade type contract that you would put in to extend your contingency.
And then just another comment about custom prints. Brett and I talked about putting all of the rec letters in the V2 funding BP, but the criteria memos would be in, for AE, it would be in PS agreements. And for a CMR design builder, it would be in best value agreements or whatever it is.
That's a very good point, and the criteria are easier to produce from the individual BPs that we're creating the contractor agreement. So that's why we want to put them there.
Right.
So you are correct. We'll find the rec letters in the funding BP, but when you're looking for the criteria, those are going to be in the agreement or contract business process that's associated with the item.
We also wanted to try to avoid having too many different files to select for the custom print in the funding.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it gets confusing fast.
It does.
Hey, Steve, this is Sylvia. So consultant list doesn't have a funding BP yet, right?
That is a good point, and I probably should have had that in the slides here. As of today, June of 2021, consultant list is an exception to this process and is still being done the old way. Craig and I have talked about that, and I think in September, which is the maybe date for moving the issue of contracts to finance. But when that occurs, I think we're going to try to update the consultant list so that it joins this process as well. But right now, the consultant list BP has its own funding stream built in. And right now, that does not include calculating the admin fees, so the coordinators would still be calculating those manually. And we are aware of that and absolutely intend to rectify that, but we're not going to rectify it right now. I think that will happen in the fall.
So where should the consultant list or could the consultant recommendation letter go?
That should go in the agreement BP, because that's where we're doing consulting.
PS agreements. Okay, great.
Correct.
Thank you.
Hey, Steve, did you see Christina's question in the chat?
I did not, and I actually will have to change screens here to get to the chat.
My question, this is Christina, is when we do a contingency contract, I assume we do a funding BP for contingency as well?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not part of the construction rec letter funding?
So here's the thing, and I'll go back again. You basically have a funding record for each purchase order you want to issue, and you're going to have an E&C purchase order for your contingency, which is separate from your construction contractor's purchase order. So you're not just adding the contingency to your construction contractor's contract. You're putting it on a separate purchase order. So you will need a record for that because you're going to need a contract number for that contingency purchase order.
So we'll have to modify our custom print for the construction rec letter slightly to include the contingency information.
I see Ned nodding his head. Yes, I don't know, but we can definitely do that.
I don't know that we need to modify the letter. We just need to plug the number in.
Well, Steve said when you're asking for more than one purchase order for more than one vendor, in your rec letter, you have to modify. So I'm assuming that would be this case. You're going to have a purchase order request for the contract or the construction contract or contracts. And then you're going to have one also for the construction contingency, because usually with an agency, it's a separate purchase order.
If you mean by modify that you have to manually plug in the number that you're requesting for the contingency, then yes, but you don't have to modify the structure of the letter.
No, I think this goes back to what you said, Lane, about running the BP for each purchase order that you want to figure out what the language would be, and then you put it in one letter. Is that not correct?
You're just plugging in a number for the contingency.
Yeah, the case of the contingency should be pretty easy. And you would want to send one rec letter for the construction contract, the contingency, and our fees.
So then we have a rec letter for one vendor. We have a rec letter for multiple vendors. And then we have a rec letter for a construction vendor and the contingency. So we have three different types of rec letters.
Now, for every construction rec letter, you're going to need a contingency amount, right?
I would think so.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And if you had a multiple prime contract with 4 contracts, you'd run the funding BP 5 times, but you'd consolidate all those amounts on one letter.
Right. Okay.
And then the budget would be consistent across the board, as I understand it.
So the rec letter is set up automatically to handle a construction contract and the purchase order for contingency.
Yes, and there are notes that say you can add additional contracts, and then there's a total amount of the contracts on it. So you just have to follow the instructions on the new construction rec letter.
All right. Good.
And we don't have the rec letters finalized for CMR or DB, but we're working on them. And we do have the consultant rec letter done. We're working on the consultant amendment rec letter. And, but I think we've got the AE agreement and amendment We've got the construction contractor now. So we're about halfway through the process. We tried to hit the most used letters first. And now that we've got the language settled down a little bit, that was part of the problem, is the language kept changing. So we're a little more stable now.
All right, so kind of to wrap up funding, it's a new process. We expect questions. I expect there will still be some additional tweaks to it as we go forward. So coordinators are kind of on point with all this. As you have questions, feel free to hit me up on Teams directly. If you can't get hold of me directly, then go through the support desk, and Shauna's folks will help you. We're all going to kind of learn together, and I think it's a solid process. I think it's going to need some tweaks before we get it to be efficient and covering all bases. And I'm sure there's some things we haven't thought about in here. Consultant list would be case number one. I really hadn't even thought about consultant list until Sylvia brought it up, and I was like, uh-oh, yes, there's work that we need to do there. So we'll continue to make adjustments to it and get it working. If you can stand another PowerPoint presentation, I apologize, but I don't. I actually shared this one with you a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to go through it again. And just kind of reemphasize this. I had lots of great questions that came out of this. And one of them was from the K-12 folks. Here, I'm gonna turn off my camera while I'm presenting. That they asked, do these apply to us? And for the most part, with the exception of funding, they apply to both agency and K-12 projects. So I wanted to just kind of walk through this again and let you know that you've had 2 or 3 weeks to think about it, ask questions. Think about it in terms of the 50 projects that we already have in flight, because those 50 projects need all of these things inserted into them, in some cases sooner rather than later. Obviously, on the agency side, to get ready for funding, a lot of this is a required prerequisite to get there. So I just wanted to kind of walk through this again. A couple of things have changed a little bit, but basically do the automation that we built into version 2, which includes the funding VP. It includes metrics and doing quarterly metrics for projects. There are a number of dashboards. We need these 4 activities completed before the creation of the design phase rec letter, or before the AE RFP or RFQ goes out, basically. So we're asking you to get up in the front of the project and do these 4 things. In some cases, these are going to require project managers to kind of develop some new processes with your agencies, and maybe even need to involve your program managers to assist in doing that, because the agencies may or may not be as cooperative as we'd like them to be. So the first area we'll talk about is budget. We've always had a budget to start a project. We used to put budgets in the project information business process. I actually took the budget out of project information because it was always wrong there. So we now have a process that's being followed by everybody to do a budget in the budget allocation tool and push that budget to OAKS. We've not necessarily always done that at the very start of the project. So what we need at the very start of the project, once the shell's been set up in OAKS, is for you to establish your initial budget in the budget allocation tool and then push that budget to OAKS. Ideally, you would do that even before you go get your AE on board. And then once you get your AE on board, you would update your budget allocation budget and push it again. And each time you push your budget to OAKS, what you do is you replace the previous budget with the new one. So we have statuses on all your budgets, and the statuses are current. So there will be one and only one current budget. And then everything else, the status gets changed to replaced. So you can actually go in and look at a history of your budgets by going to the data manager, not logs, but go to the data manager and look under original budget version 2. And there you'll see all of the budgets that you've pushed into OCI over time. So typically I would expect you to push budgets 3 times, once at the beginning of the project. I would expect a second budget push after you have your design phase contractors on and you know what their costs are, but that firms up some of your costs. And then once you have your construction contracts in place and you know what those are, would expect a third push. There may be cases where you want to do more budget pushes than that, and that's fine. There's really no limit. So let's well, let's go to presentation mode here for openers. So the initial budget for agency staff, the initial budget in the original budget B2 will be used for design phase admin fee calculation and billing. If you do an update before we do the rec letter process, then it will be the most recent budget that's out there. So we're going to look at the current budget. I think we actually have the coordinator go in and select the budget that we want to use. So that's one of the reasons why getting a budget in is important. We also have a metric based on budget, which is another reason why getting that budget in early is important. Second thing, and this is the one that's agency only, admin fee structure. So with your program manager and finance, if necessary, determine the correct billing structure to be used. We talked about that in the earlier presentation. Admin fee billing structure has now been added to the project initiation form. That's something that Shauna did just earlier this week. So the new form that's out there will have that in it now. And if you don't put it in, I'm sure that they'll be asking you for it before they create the project for you. And that admin fee structure is used for admin fee calculation and billing, including the rec letter creation. And it's really the rec letter creation that made us change our current process. We had finance actually putting those in, and they would talk with the project managers in terms of what it should be. But now rec letter creation will fail if there's no admin fee structure in there, and it'll be wrong if the wrong structure is in there. We said, hey, let's back that up to the beginning of the project. We should know what fee structure we're going to use when we start the project. So the third one is the one I've gotten the most questions on, and that's funding. K-12 seems to have a good understanding of how to get their funding information in. Agency is struggling a little bit. And so what we're looking for here are the kind of the 5 items in blue up there from the financial folks at the agency or at the K-12 district. And so we're looking for, it says here OAKS it would be the financial system of record, whichever it is. We're looking for the fund name, and that's just the name we're going to put on it. So when they're picking it, when they record the purchase order or voucher, it will make sense to them. We're looking for 3 codes. So there's the ALI, the program code, and the department org code. And anybody that's familiar with OAKS will know what those are. And then finally, how much funding is being provided by that particular code. These can be changed through the project, like budgets and other things change. It's perfectly acceptable to change the funding mix through the project. You can bring new funds in. You can change the amount from funds. So once you get that funding information, then we'd have you provide it to the support desk, and they will set up the funding in OCI. There's a couple of steps to doing that. And then ideally, we want that funding information when you request your OCI project shelf. So we want to go ahead and get it when we set the project up. So in those early discussions with the agency, we're going to have to add the question of, hey, how are you paying for this? What are the ALI program code and department org code that you might need? Barb has mentioned that in some cases, the agency may not have that all set up in OAKS until after controlling board. So there may be cases where you know where they're getting their money from, but we don't know what these codes are yet. And in those cases, we would have you provide them once they were available. Again, they need to be in there before a purchase order can be logged. So it behooves us to get that information and get it put in a timely fashion. On most projects, your funding amount should equal your project budget. There will be cases where projects are crossing bienniums and they're not funding all of it. And that's fine. So if you don't have funding for all of your project budget, that's not a problem from an OCI perspective. Again, when funding gets added, we need to have that communication line so that we know what it was. I mentioned before, it's got to be set up to record any purchase order. And we're currently developing an interface to record purchase orders automatically. And that interface will also fail if we don't have funding set up in OCI correctly. So we won't be able to do any of the automated setup of that. Questions for me about funding before I move on?
Steve, there's a question about what does ALI stand for?
Okay, some finance person, tell me, what does
Well,
ALI
I
stand
answered
for?
it in the chat. It stands for appropriation line item.
That's it. I was thinking application line items, and no, that's not right. No, so appropriation line item. So that's basically the line item out of the budget that money's coming from.
It's the line in the capital bill, basically.
Yeah.
That is
Hey,
funded.
this is Stacy. The funding must be set up in OAKS to record the AE or any other purchase order. Are you talking about agencies only, or are you talking about the district, K-12 district's purchase order?
That's true for everybody. And as I said, we've been getting the funding set up well for our K-12 districts. We haven't had a lot of issues there. I don't know what the process that's getting that done is, but the process seems to be working.
That's what I'm wondering, is who is sending out that form to the districts to get those fund codes that they're using? Because I haven't been doing it as a PM.
We received the information from the school district. They email it to us.
Okay, so OAKS is contacting them to get that information. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Shauna, can you do that for agencies too? Just asking.
Ah.
Shauna, when you get that information, can you forward it on to the PMs? Because it helps us to know, if they're breaking out, because we want them to break out everything by building and have I think they call it an OPU for each building. And if it'd be nice for the PMs to have that information up front so we know when we're looking at the FinDebt reports, what code means what building and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. My impression was the school district was working pretty closely with you guys and getting that stuff over to us. So if that's not the case, maybe I need to talk to some other PMs and find out what they're doing. But usually it's the PM working with the school district and getting that over to us.
Okay, yeah, I haven't been handling that, so.
Okay.
Hey,
Thank you.
Stacy, at the point that they start a project, they may not have OPU set up for those new buildings yet because of how their software system works.
Okay,
So the fund code, the cost centers, that'll be set up, but OPU, sometimes they wait because of the requirements for reporting in EMIS and for the auditor state.
okay. Is the fund code and cost center the same thing? Are we talking the same thing, or are those two different things?
Those are two different codes that the district uses. So
Okay.
they have a fund code, the 010,
Okay,
the 004 typically are the two codes that are most frequently used.
okay,
And
What-
then this cost centers would frequently they'll use special cost centers to distinguish the different buildings at the early stages of a project.
oh, okay, so the cost center is the one that's identifying the building, not the OPU?
Yes, no. The OPU is definitely at the end of the day, the identifier for the building. But it's just, it's a timing issue when you're setting up your chart of accounts in a school district. That
Okay.
you may not want to set up the OPU until you finally, you may want to transfer the OPU from, if they're kind of replacing a building, they won't want to do a new OPU, but they don't want to transfer it to this new building at this point in time because it's not operating.
Okay. Complicated. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
And Craig, or I'm sorry, Steve, you're saying that for even for K-12, we need to push a budget in into OAKS from the budget allocation tool before we can even send out an AE RFQ?
Yes,
Is that a requirement?
yes. Otherwise, your metrics will not work. So that's, I mean, we have a lot of different things downstream of these items. And so that's why we basically came in and said, okay, so with version 2, we need these 4 things provided up front by everybody.
So if we don't know the LFI and we don't have that amount in there, that's not going to be a problem though, right?
Budgets can change over time. And yeah, you know, at project agreement, we have a project agreement LFI. So in my mind, your first budget is your project agreement. How are you going to distribute that money? Almost every project changes their LFI after project agreement, and that's fine.
So
You know,
one question I do have on the project initiation form, it asked for the project budget. Are you asking on that project initiation form only for co-funded, or are you wanting co-funded and project agreement LFI, or everything you have at that time?
I think we want everything you have at that time because that's the money that you're going to manage in OCI.
Okay, because I was confused. I was thinking the project initiation was only wanting the co-funded amount.
No, we would want everything that's going to be managed in OCI. So I mean, your budget would include all of your authorized LFI. So if you had project agreement LFI, day one, you would have that money that you are managing within the project.
But LFIs aren't necessarily approved. It's just a budget in there. It hasn't been fully approved by the board via an LFI MOU execution at GMP. That's where my confusion was.
And again, as we've designed it, that every time you push a new record to OCI, we're going to change your budget. So if you execute a LFI MOU and your LFI amount changes there, I'm guessing that you're distributing that new money within your budget somehow. So I'm expecting that you would want to do an update to your budget on whichever buildings were affected by that LFI MOU. And I know LFI is a topic for another day because I know there have been some discussions about updating the way we do LFIs with the districts as well. So.
And Steve, I thought the planning tool somehow created the budget for K-12.
The planning tool does provide an initial budget, which basically becomes the project agreement.
Okay.
So, you know, K-12 has their initial budget really easy because we do a project agreement, and the dollars that are in that project agreement are their budget. And then, like every other project, that changes over time with conditions. We do amendments. We do LFI MOUs.
And so I'm not sure how K-12 communicates the amount for the POs that they need from the school district. Could they use the rec letters?
Probably a topic for another day.
Gotcha.
Today, we're in agreement that we don't need a funding BP, funding type BP to do that. But we're also in agreement that that might be useful in the future. So that's kind of where Craig and I have left it.
Okay.
Hey, Steve, this is Sylvia. Can I ask a question?
You sure can.
Did you, so I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but did you say that the funding BP looked at the project initiation form for numbers? Because I know on agency side, we don't always know everything at project initiation, so we can't really use what's on that form to go with the funding BP.
The funding BP itself is going to use a original budget record for the creation of the fees. It's going to use which commit you selected, so which agreement or contract or GMP amendment or et cetera that you selected. And those are the things that it will use to do its calculations. It doesn't really bring in anything from project information.
Okay.
A lot of that project initiation form goes into project information.
Sylvia, the rec letter was pulling the budget from project initiation, but Brett is working on changing that.
Okay, that's what I thought it was doing originally, but I just wanted to make sure because that's wrong.
But that's the custom print, not the funding BP.
Ah, okay, okay. Yeah, it definitely needs to be pulled from the funding, I mean, from the budget, not from the project initiation, because then it's always going to be wrong.
If it hasn't happened already, he's working on changing it.
Okay, thanks.
And that was part of our design for version 2. It just, you know, mistakes get made. So.
While we're fixing that, can we fix custom prints not to pull from the project initiation form too? Because it still pulls wrong information all the time. Because it was what was originally put into the project.
What are you talking about? I mean, that is
like
the
the names of people, like Jenny Hildebrandt is no longer with DRC. Her name still keeps popping up on stuff because it was what was on the original project initiation form.
Well,
the Huntington Bank address still comes in. Yeah, I can change it, but I'm just asking.
It pulls it not from the project initiation form, but from the project information record, which can be changed.
It doesn't affect the custom prints after you change it.
That's also probably a topic for another day. And Sylvia is correct. The basic rule, and then we'll move back to the topic that we're talking about here. The basic thing that happens is when any record gets created, any auto populations are going to happen from project information occur at creation, and Unifier never updates those. So if a record already existed and had Jenny Hildebrandt on it, there's no good way to change it on that record. Now, what happens to us is we compound that because I don't bring the name for a change order from project information necessarily. It may come from the contract record. So way back at the beginning of the project, Jenny was there and the contract record got created, and now that name is getting perpetuated, and even fixing it in project information doesn't necessarily get it fixed. So in some cases like this, we may need to go in and change it on the contract. Old original OAKS, the philosophy was to hide all the custom print information. Version 2, particularly if you're doing custom prints, you're going to see all that information. Not only is it not hidden, but it's editable. And what I want to get to is get to the ability to make more of those changes in places where they're actually helpful, like on the contract or where things are originating from. So advanced topic for another day, but that's what's going on there. And there's in the original version, there's not a good solution to how to make that work correctly, other than fix it on the custom print. hoping on version 2, we've laid down some groundwork to make it better. I haven't gotten there on any of our version 2 projects yet, though, so that's again, advanced topic for a future date. We talked about 3 of the things that need set up before, or at the very beginning of the project, basically, but before you start going out and hiring people, hiring architects. The 4th one is milestones. And we just want you to create and complete the project milestones version 2 record. Projects should only have one project version 2 record. The BP will allow you to create multiple records, but none of the downstream reporting, and in particular the metrics reporting, work with multiple records in this BP. So we want you to have a single record for the entire duration of the project. As project stages change, you should go in and change them in the milestones BP. So you should probably be touching your milestones BPs on a quarterly basis, somewhat before we do metrics, and just updating project stage, because that gets pulled from here and gets put in things like the commission report. So if we're reporting to the commission on what stages we have projects in, we're expecting that project milestones is correct. And it kind of makes us look silly if those are not correct for a large number of projects and the data doesn't make sense.
Steve, I inherited a project that has 2 milestone records. Should I delete one?
Yeah, just change the status to terminated or to complete. But basically, we only want one active project milestone record. You
Okay.
change the status of the old one, then you'll be fine.
Okay, good, thank you.
The way our metrics and whatnot work today, if there is no project milestones record at all, that project is completely excluded from all quarterly metric reporting. We don't find the project. So that's why it's important that we have the milestone records put in at the very beginning of the project, because we simply ignore the project, not only on time, on budget kinds of things, but on all the milestones. So if there's no milestones record out there, we just don't use that project. So just a word of reminder, most of the version 2 projects need those 4 items attended to. Probably makes sense to try to identify who at your agency is doing the funding and go sit down with them and get funding for all the projects for an agency at once, and then send that all into the support desk, and they'll add the funding to all the projects at that particular point in time. If you need assistance, Shauna's team can help. Your program managers can help, particularly if you're having issues with an agency not understanding why you need the information, or not wanting to give you the information. I would say that would be an opportunity to escalate that to Ned or Lane or Mike, and they'll assist you in getting that. But it's new with version 2. But we're going to need all of those things set up in the projects as soon as possible, particularly for these 40 or 50 projects that we just started in the last 2 or 3 months.
Hey, Steve, question. You said 4 items and I only tracked 3: budget, funding, and milestone. Which one did I miss?
Admin fee structure.
Okay, yep, gotcha. Had it down before. Thank you.
All right, that's all I had for today. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them. I will be back with more in future weeks, I'm sure.
Steve, I just want to thank you a lot for going through this again. Much appreciated.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Are there any questions? Feel free to raise your hand and I will recognize you, or just blurt it out.
Okay, hey, thank you, Lane. This is Bill, and I'm going to stop the recording. We captured a lot of questions and a lot of presentations, so thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.